Thanks for joining. I'm Taylor, and I'm a reporter at Fortune, and I cover cryptocurrency. I'm here with lovely panelists. Can each of you just go and introduce yourselves? Maybe, Chris, you can start.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me here. Chris Hayes, I'm the head of government relations at the Celo Foundation. The Celo Foundation is a grant-giving organization that supports the Celo Layer 1 blockchain. Pertinent for this panel is the Mento stablecoins, which track the dollar, the euro, and the Brazilian real, are native to the Celo blockchain.
Hi, my name is Jen Senhaji. I work with the Maker Growth Core Unit, which is a team that serves MakerDAO, which is a decentralized lending platform that creates the over-collateralized stablecoin DAI.
And I'm Kim Hamilton Duffy, Director of Identity and Standards at Consortium.
So we're here to talk about the importance and the case for asset-backed stablecoins in wake of, the Terra collapse that unfortunately we just saw unfold. Of course, Do Kwon's model of the algorithmic stablecoin didn't really quite work out. And this is a big problem because a lot of people have trust in these assets and they're important. So I kind of want to talk to you guys to start about how we move forward with this critical piece of crypto infrastructure, but in a way that is safe and not like a traditional bank of any other name. I'm sure all of you have thoughts on this. Maybe Chris, if you want to kick it off.
Sure. No, I think what's unfortunate about the Terra situation is really not a lot of education was done about stablecoins that aren't fiat-backed stablecoins, and unfortunately, algorithmic stablecoins, it's been sort of this debate between fiat-backed and algorithmic, which is a very large bucket of various different types of designs. And it's unfortunate because I think the real conversation should be mostly about collateralized versus under-collateralized stablecoins. And that's really the fundamental issue. And as long as the collateral can address the volatility of the asset, that's the critical component. But that's been lost in the policy discussion.
Yeah, I think, looking at why DAI was created in the first place was really to provide this more transparent and decentralized form of currency. And there's different versions of stablecoins that we'll obviously talk about today: fiat-backed stablecoins, over-collateralized stablecoins, algo stablecoins, which are kind of like not that clear in definition. But where DAI has always been a solution for is to have this fully transparent and permissionless asset. So the beauty with that is at any time you could look up what is backing the value of this DAI. And I think when there's incentive mechanisms that kind of obscure that true value, that's where things like Terra come up, and we all know the fatal flaw of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the concern that I have is that it's important to have a measured response. There's always kind of extreme, overly broad pushback. And while devastating, there are so many takeaways we can have, and we don't need to overly generalize. So takeaways include, of course, maybe if there are technical or economic, sort of flaws in the approach, things we can learn from. But then also in terms of transparency, was there unequal access to information leading up to it? And so I think that it's really important that we continue to build the canon from this. And, I think that, again, there's a lot to learn from this.
Definitely. Jen, DAI is probably arguably the most important crypto-backed stablecoin. It's heavily used. It's very trusted. I know you touched on, on-chain verifiability and kind of openness in that respect. Do you see that because of that, or do you see that the future kind of involves more stablecoins like that to kind of regain trust in this space? And what's the importance of that kind of trust and that type of system that you guys have at Maker?
Yeah, one of the earlier use cases and points of adoption for DAI in particular was in Argentina, because it's a super hyperinflationary area that people struggle with 60% inflation at any given time. So that region was like Bitcoin as a concept, this alternative form of money that is not created by a government or institution, was always kind of resonated on a much more intimate level, because they desperately are looking for a way to not lose value in their savings. So when the concept of this like stable version of Bitcoin arrived, it was just a natural, kind of appealing thing for them to look at. So, markets where there is like real issues with a dollar or with their local currency, opting into this alternative, permissionless, censorship-resistant, dollar-denominated global currency is really a lifesaver. And excuse me, I think in the United States, like stablecoins are very useful, and we could talk about all the ways that they're very useful, but the decentralization aspect or attribute doesn't really matter so much sometimes. So like any of us up here that we want to buy an NFT or trade on an exchange and we need a stablecoin, Circle is a great option. USDC is a great option. Celo's stablecoin is a great option, right? It's going to do the job. But it's really more critical for the decentralization of a stablecoin when you are outside of these markets that don't suffer so much with inflation.
Well, Jen, I think you make a really good point there, and it's something that we've been looking at with the Mento stablecoins that are on Celo, and we've done that with launching a Brazilian real-based stablecoin, is the potential for, it's a little bit more challenging for a fiat-backed structure for you to scale up and support kind of these countries that aren't in necessarily the developed world, and then it allows you to do different monetary policy, right? So you have increased flexibility, the ability to scale up and build these stable coins for folks outside the dollar, euro kind of traditional currency space. And I think that's one of the real values of a decentralized stablecoin, and avoids potentially some of the regulatory headwinds around these in developed markets.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, Kim, with USDC is massive, and do you think that, I guess, like having kind of the backing of the bank backing is kind of like a hedge, because we always hear decentralized is best and so on, but like Jen and Chris mentioned that sometimes it's helpful to have some strong backing there where you feel safe, especially when it's your money. So can you maybe talk to the pros of a fiat-backed stablecoin and what you're seeing?
Exactly. And so, USDC is backed by US dollars or high quality assets. And so I think that's in terms of the security, safety that people get from transacting with it, it's just one of the many options. I think that it's important to preserve choice as part of this. So what are some factors? Like one might be consumer protection. If you're more interested in optimizing for that, at some use cases that's required. But in other cases, you might be looking more for censorship resistance. And so I think that, even though I'm here sort of representing the most boring stablecoin, I think that we'll increasingly see kind of a carve-out use case fits. Pending regulation may change that a lot. I think cross-border payments for stablecoins really always stands out as something where they may shine. And so no matter what's happening, sort of in whether it's FedNow or CDBCs or whatever, I think we're going to still see a lot of interesting experiments and learning.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes something boring in crypto is refreshing. It doesn't have to be so haphazard all the time. Speaking of regulation, obviously, we don't really know where things are going to go 100%. But what should stablecoin regulation look like? I know, Chris, I'm sure you have opinions on this. If you want to start.
Sure. No, thanks. And we've been really actively engaged in conversations, as I know the others on the panel have been, in Europe in regard to MiCA, the regulatory framework that is coming to an end to be released soon, as well as various stablecoin legislation in the U.S. I mean, I think our perspective is, fiat-backed stablecoins are necessary, helpful in the market, but that we really don't want to close the door to innovation with an on-chain reserve. So obviously, Jenna touched on this fully transparent and real-time element of having a on-chain reserve. And as we think about longer term, we don't want to close the door to the idea that traditional financial instruments that will become on-chain, and we're seeing more of that in the market. A private equity fund was recently tokenized. There's other kind of these traditional assets. And if the regulatory structures close the door to that, I think that's really harmful, given that we're going to see more of these traditional assets that could provide some of that necessary consumer protection that we were just discussing.
Anything to add, Jen and Kim?
On stablecoin regulation in particular, I mean, I think right now it's actually kind of hard to stay on top of all the different proposed bills. There were like a lot this week in on different topics.
Right.
But I think, in general, having some clarity on how, stablecoin issuers will be treated is important for certain user groups, particularly institutional user groups, right? So that clarity is, of course, welcomed. I think everybody could probably agree, like the kind of quick enforcement, regulation by enforcement tactic does not seem healthy, right? And everything is a little bit different. Like all of our stablecoins are produced differently, and I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all type of regulation that should treat them all. So I think as long as there's, careful consideration about the mechanisms, healthy regulation could come about, and that will be a positive.
And what I hope as well is that any regulation we see preserves some principles, right? So innovation, choice, and access. So a lot of us are just not here to end up with something really boring that basically is just equivalent to a bank-issued, bank currency. So I think that, or typical fiat currency. So I think that, really what we're seeing here is, we need to make sure that, whether it's opening up on-ramps or access or any sort of aspects of the financial system where there's gatekeeping in place. I think we have a lot of opportunities to continue to explore that. And yes, just very hoping that specific methods are not ruled out as we move forward. I think that anything that gets sort of overly tied to, or in terms of specific techniques, either of getting the information, like the requirements of transparency, disclosure, overly targeting those methods, or ruling out, specific, categories of stablecoins. So those are the kinds of things we want to, navigate.
Definitely. And as you guys have mentioned, it's better, I guess, to have multiple options and not just decide whether crypto-backed or fiat-backed is better, and each have their own use cases. But can we maybe talk to the importance of having options, or the importance of having different methods of growing this ecosystem, as it grows, even in the wake of things like the Terra collapse, how important it is to kind of preserve that, or how important is that?
Oh, is that, sorry.
Oh, any of you can take.
Okay.
Yeah, I think as far as having optionality in designs is great, because we don't want to just replicate the current financial system, on a blockchain, and call it a day, right? So I think experimenting and looking at different ways to back, value is important. Some of those experiments aren't well intentioned from the beginning, and they're going to end up, doing more harm than good. But I think, there's still a lot of different variations that we haven't seen using different types of stablecoins, not just USD denominated, different fiat denominations would be interesting. So yeah, I think having optionality in types of stablecoins is good overall.
I wanted to bring up something you just said, Jen, is really this. So one of the unique features that we've been experimenting with, I think, at Celo, so Celo Layer 1 is really focused on regenerative finance around sustainability, and we've been really focused on this idea of natural backed assets. So the idea of backing our money with things we care about, like climate change, addressing climate change, being able to look at backing stablecoins with tokenized carbon credits, for instance. And a small proportion of our reserve is currently dedicated that way. And this kind of thinks about what are other ways that we can back stablecoins that you can do in a decentralized context that is unique and not just backed by debt, as these money has been traditionally, but also done in a way that is safe for consumers in terms of addressing liquidity risk and these, certainly valid concerns that we've seen with the Terra situation. So I think that's a really unique facet of what we're doing, as opposed to just re-replicating the financial system. And I also think it's why it's important that not just bank chartered entities should be able to be issuing stablecoins. So
Right. And I do think a part of it is, so I think right now there's a lot of barriers for a lot of reasons. Again, consumer protection. I think that one thing that's interesting as we move forward, maybe we'll learn there are some areas where the traditional financial system has, some efficiencies or some certain use cases covered, but it's clear we're still learning a lot, and it's clear that there are efficiency improvements we can make with stablecoins. And so, and a lot of people may not be able to be safely exposed to some of the advantages of them. So, one thing that stands out would be like Coinbase ETH, for example, a wrap staked ETH, and all kinds of these things that maybe people can use or offer to their customers that aren't offering necessarily outlandish yields, but maybe something better than they can normally get access to.
And I think building on that, of course, we've mentioned this throughout, but just kind of emphasizing the importance of, audits and how that could be trusted, even if it's something like with carbon offsets, which I'm not even going to get into because that's a whole different panel for a different time. But to kind of get a customer to, buy in and spend their dollars or their currency and invest in this and hold it with security, it's important to kind of have this reliable, the company's telling me the truth and so on about audits and things like that. How do you think that will evolve over time? Not to bring up, but with Tether, there's a lot of controversy and things like that about trust. So at the end of the day, of course, like anything else, trust is so important. So how do you see that kind of evolving and coming into play as we discussed, the case for these kinds of assets?
I can start with that. And sorry, I didn't know she said your name to start.
No.
Okay, cool. So I think that one thing that's been really interesting, so I think a characteristic of Center that people aren't really familiar with is that, so we're a standards organization. We have the open source of the Center Tokens contract, which is the smart contract backing USDC. We also create rules governing USDC and requirements around disclosure, transparency, and I think that it's really these kind of consortium-led efforts like that I find really interesting. Like, if we want to avoid complete top-down kind of prescriptive, this is how you do it, I think it's more interesting to sort of evolve these principles, and these are the kinds of things that could be applied to any kind of, say, stablecoin or cryptocurrency. And so I'm hoping that, especially with any legislation coming out, that we sort of preserve the ability to do that and develop these principles that can be reused.
Definitely. Anyone want to add anything?
Yeah, I would just say again, like, the kind of gift that these decentralized systems provide, an improvement on the current financial system, is the transparency. And so you can, again, look at any time to see what is backing something, right? And you don't have to wonder if the reports from an issuer are correct, or you're going to find out something is different in 2 months from that point. So I think, like one example with Maker, when there was like all of the kind of the market drop based on Terra and Celsius and all of these major liquidation events from the contagion of 3AC, the vaults in Maker were all managed, liquidated as they were designed to, based on the conditions set by an individual position. So what does that mean? So with Maker, anyone can lock up collateral, any type of collateral that is supported, generate DAI. You don't have to talk to anybody. It's done permissionlessly. And then your responsibility as the user is to know your liquidation threshold. So if your collateral falls below a certain point, the system will automatically liquidate you in order to make sure there's enough DAI backing what that position was, and the system is solvent. So even in those kind of crazy days, Maker as a whole didn't have any bad debt. No, I mean those positions were closed out,
Right.
not by a human, not by a bankruptcy proceeding. It was just managed and handled by the smart contracts. So I think again, just thinking in terms of why are we here? What are we doing? It's like what is better than the current financial system and smart contracts and this kind of transparency is that better part, right?
Right.
So that to me, I feel like is like a bright spot in the
Definitely.
past year.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in on that. So I think, as you mentioned, one of the primary benefits, and Mento is structured a little differently, but you can basically go to mento.reserve.org and see in real time what assets are backing the stablecoin. And I think what's really critical in that post-Terra is, being sufficiently over-collateralized for dealing with both being crypto collateralized. If you're sufficiently over-collateralized, you can address the volatility. Mm-hmm. And I think when you look at the Terra situation, you're looking at 18 billion in circulation with a $5 billion reserve, which if in the Mento context, we had a 3 times over-collateralized reserve from all the stablecoins in circulation. Even with the drop in prices post-crypto winter here, we still are 2 times over-collateralized and maintain the peg. So, but I also think it's quite interesting from a context of learning from these events, right? So, before we had Terra, we had Iron. So I think this kind of structure where you just have your native token backing a stablecoin is not really, it repeatedly has failed over time. But I think, we have adjusted our reserve in regard to what happened with Terra to ensure greater stability, to make sure that folks can be ensured that they will have one-to-one and you won't have a bank run situation. And I think that is how folks have been adapting to sort of these lessons learned. And increasingly our reserve has a lot of USDC in it. And but in the future that reserve could have wholesale CBDCs, right? As digital euro comes online or some of these other CBDCs, you're allowing that sort of access for private stablecoins, but then government money backing it. So there's a lot of different variations that could develop in the future.
Yeah, and that's what's really exciting here. So you mentioned near real-time proof of reserves. There's levels of transparency possible that we never had before, and so these are areas that I'd like to see us sort of prescribed or self-developed standards around what we want to see.
Definitely. And we have less than a minute, so this is a bit rushed.
Oh.
But if one of you may want to, just kind of talk to what you're most excited about with cross-border payments, or just looking ahead, in this space, what's most exciting to you? Any takers?
I mean, I think folks are starting to coalesce as someone who's involved in the policy debate around some clarity about what the standards will be in the future, and that gives direction on how these assets can be developed in a safe way with consumer protection being addressed. And I think I'm excited about watching that movement happen where you can generate that comfort from users.
All right.
Yeah, I don't know if I would use the word excited, but I think I'm looking forward to now all of these conversations particularly in the US, from regulators taking place, and you can hear there are some Congress people that definitely get this technology and are really supportive of it and want it to continue and flourish. So I'm kind of looking forward to this point where the recognition that crypto as an asset class is welcomed, wanted, and will be able to be used in safe, compliant ways without always having to guess, like, are we doing this okay?
Right.
I think we're out of time.
Oh, yes.
Kim, if you want to wrap quick.
Yes, definitely. So yeah, definitely interested in developing, refining use case fit, and also community develop governance and standards.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much. Thank you all. That's that.